Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Rare Disease Drug Launch Lessons Learned to Ensure Success is Not a Rare Event. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require assistance, please contact me at any time by sending me a message using that chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Hirschspiegel Consulting, who developed the content for this presentation. Hirschspiegel Consulting specializes in pharmaceutical and biotech commercialization, helping clients with strategy through execution in 5 core service areas of new product planning, marketing, launch readiness, medical affairs, and market access. They offer integrative, tailored consulting services to meet your brand and business needs. Their diverse team brings experience from over 65 product launches, strategy and innovation leadership, and executional support for startup to large pharma clients. Their diverse team brings experience, they have experience across a wide variety of therapeutic areas, including oncology, rare disease, metabolic disease, CNS, dermatology, women's health, and others. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's webinar. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Beth Sherman, partner at Hirschspiegel Consulting. Beth has helped to grow Hirschspiegel Consulting during the last 12 years into a world-class firm helping clients with commercial strategy, innovation, and execution. She has been involved in the new product commercialization and brand optimization across oncology, CNS, metabolic disease, dermatology, women's and men's health, from rare disease to blockbuster brands. And now I'd like to introduce you to your second speaker, and that is Jennifer Beachel, Vice President Commercial at Momenta Pharmaceuticals. Jennifer has led commercial organizations and teams over a 20-year career in the biopharma industry. Her expertise spans the commercial disciplines of market access, pricing, positioning, sales, promotions, and patient services. Jennifer is recognized as a commercialization expert with both early strategy and late-stage experience. She also has a background in digital health, direct-to-consumer marketing, and healthcare policy. Now it is my pleasure to pass over the controls to our first speaker, and that is Beth. So Beth, when you're ready, you may begin.
Thank you, Sonia. I appreciate that. Thank you all for joining today. We're really thrilled to spend the next hour sharing with you some insights in rare disease. I'm extremely pleased that Jen Beachel has been able to clear her calendar for an hour to join us as well. Jen's been a pleasure to work with, and her team at Momenta as they've been preparing for the commercialization of rare disease. She'll talk a little bit today about her experiences there and prior. And we'll be bringing to you also our experience from the Hirschspiegel Consulting team in rare disease in the latest launches and the future of rare disease launch. Jen, do you want to say a moment to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today and excited to talk about rare disease. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Jen. We'll talk a bit about the landscape of rare disease, and we'll really focus in on what it looks like as you're trying to commercialize a rare disease product, whether that's your first commercialization as an organization or one among a portfolio. And how do you think about the challenges and the opportunities to de-risk and accelerate your launch? And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A, so please do type in your questions throughout, and we'll address them at the end. Just a minute about Hirschspiegel Consulting. We're a boutique agency. We specialize in pharmaceutical and biotech commercialization. That means strategy and implementation support across new product planning. We do a tremendous amount of product launch preparation, just about everything you can think of in terms of marketing strategy, implementation, innovation, and brand support. We have a team of MDs and PhDs who support medical affairs, strategy, market shaping initiatives, and a leading market access strategy and implementation practice that really helps understand the opportunities to engage with payers and how to optimize the value of the brand and the access opportunities. Now, get into rare disease. For those of you who are joining, we often get individuals from a variety of backgrounds, from clinical to commercial, vendor side and client side. So we'll try and think about all of you as we go through this, but again, please ask questions in the Q&A box. Rare disease has a specific definition, both here in the US and in the EU, relative to the epidemiology numbers. In the US, it's a disease that affects less than 200,000 people. In the EU, it's defined as something that's, seen 1 in about 2,000 patients or less. So relatively rare. There've been about 7,000 rare diseases identified to date, and that generally affects 25 to 30 million people, so relatively small in terms of the overall population of the world. But as you think about rare disease in its totality, it becomes a really broader category to think about, and how do we approach commercialization for rare disease versus those larger types of brands. It's been an interesting space to work in the last decade or more, as the opportunities for drugs and biologics have increased. In fact, we've seen upwards of 600 drug and biologic products approved. And there's a reason for that shift and the opportunities for patients to have access to new medications. The market has grown with about 7,500 orphan drug designation requests to date here in the US. And it actually accounts for about 40 to 50% of recent FDA approvals. In fact, the global orphan drug market is anticipated to be about $250 billion by 2024, which will be about 20% of global prescription sales. So again, individually, it's a small population of patients, but as you look at rare disease in aggregate, it's becoming more and more a large impact in the pharmaceutical industry. What's happened to drive so much growth? There's actually a few things that are incentives for rare disease development, which is great for patients and physicians treating them. Funding has increased with direct grants and tax incentives. There's technical assistance available from government and regulatory bodies to help in clinical design and in the registrational filing itself. Most importantly, rare disease designation typically applies accelerated review for the process, so you can get to market faster. And if you're doing a pediatric rare disease, you actually can have access to a priority review voucher, which would increase review time significantly, or can be resold for revenue to be used in other purposes. So that can provide a real benefit to commercial manufacturers as well. And there's a 7-year marketing exclusivity here in the US. So there's a lot of incentives to develop rare disease, and it's been designed that way particularly in order to drive innovation in the marketplace, which is again great for patients and physicians. We'll talk today about some of the challenges in rare disease, because we believe that you're coming to hear our talk to try and figure out, okay, as I'm facing a new commercialization, what can I think about? How can I really ensure that we do our best to get this product to customers and to support our customers' needs? Rare disease, really, you see a lot of unique things and unique challenges, especially around patient identification, which starts to impact development right at the beginning when you're working through trial recruitment issues, which we'll talk more about in a few slides. The customer support needs, as you try and think about how to support these rare patients that are sometimes a needle in a haystack, you want to provide the best possible support and be able to reach them and have them be able to reach you as a manufacturer or the physician audience very quickly. But with the small numbers, it can be challenging to implement that. Luckily, some of the digital innovation in recent years has made that a bit easier. So we'll talk about that again. Supply chain, unlike the large blockbuster brands where it's about getting the most pills out, in the marketplace quickly and having them everywhere, with rare disease, You may even have cold chain issues with some products. There's supply chain challenges in rare disease and getting product to that one individual patient or few patients in one individual geography. So having supply chain expertise as a commercial team can be really impactful in ensuring quick access to drug. And while there's not a lot of limitations on gaining approval for rare disease once you've proven efficacy and safety, the affordability can be a challenge for patients, and demonstrating value and really ensuring that payers, both national payers and commercial payers, cover the drug and make it affordable for patients can take a lot of engagement and discussion and educating the marketplace. And some of the challenges as the marketplace grows, increasing competition. You think about rare disease, you come out with some very innovative approach for a mechanism of action. One would think the science sells itself, but the evolving marketplace of competition can make that more challenging. So real thoughtfulness about the commercial environment is necessary in rare disease and will be increasingly so. We'll talk more about how do you approach these as a commercial team. What we'll focus on are some key critical success factors. How do you address the patient identification with accurate epidemiology? How do you find the patients who are diagnosed and in care? And rare disease, many of them can pose particular problems with the length of time to get diagnosed. So how do you, as a commercial organization or a clinical organization, enhance the ability to self-diagnose or self-identify and improve diagnosis by healthcare providers? Some of that is through digital means, some of that is through education. So we'll talk a bit more about that and ensuring that the accurate epidemiology is identified. Secondarily, customer engagement. Early and enduring engagement to meet customer needs. That's payers, that's healthcare providers, that's patients themselves, that's caregivers. Customers also can mean the advocacy organizations that represent those critical patients and caregivers. So there's a broad array of customer engagement that you need to think about. How do you find them? How do you communicate with them? How do you best support their needs? Access strategy is very critical. It will be increasingly critical as the marketplace gets more competitive. So ensuring that you have a really robust access strategy and you engage early and you help remove access barriers for patients. And one final thing we'll talk about is organizational capabilities and the skills and resources to support commercialization and how to best approach that to de-risk and accelerate a launch. Let me move my slide ahead here. One brief case study, we really want to bring examples from our experiences, and I'll let Jen share some of hers in the few next slides as well, but I thought it was interesting to share one that I've in particular been exposed to, where rare disease, a lot of times the science is what's driving development. That completely makes sense, but having a commercial lens earlier in the process is also incredibly valuable. The opportunity to accurately identify the epidemiology data, the value opportunity for the brand, and how you will engage and find customers, both HCPs who focus on a rare disease and patients, will be incredibly critical. We were involved with a rare disease launch recently where we got involved with the teams as it was starting to transition from the clinical development into commercial teams. And unfortunately, this particular moderate-sized pharma had not really had a lot of commercial engagement early in the process. And as it was transitioning into strategic planning for the brand, it became increasingly clear that the epidemiology perspective was wildly different between the clinical team and the commercial team. As we thought about who the patients were, how you define the patient population, and how to find the patients that were diagnosed or could potentially be diagnosed, the commercial opportunity was significantly smaller than the clinical team had thought might be identified, in part because of how the patient characteristics were ultimately finally defined. And so as we thought about the brand strategy and forecast, it was a very different picture for the organization than had been evaluated throughout the initial clinical stages of the brand. And that can really be a problem for an organization as you think about what are you going to do with this? How much resources you've put against it? How much could you do with it from a commercial perspective? So we really try to help teams align strategy cross-functionally, bring that commercial thought earlier into new product planning and into the design even of clinical trials to ensure that you have the right approach and the right data when you come out of phase 2 or phase 3 trials to be able to commercialize the product. Jen, have you had any experiences in similar situations that you might want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one that comes to mind that a lot of rare disease companies go through is particularly when they've entered into an adult rare disease market. Often, as we know, the FDA will require you to do a pediatric study as well, which is, really beneficial for the patient organizations and patients and families who suffer from the disease, because of course, the rare disease legislation was really designed to try to drive research in younger populations. And but this idea of not quite grasping the epidemiology and having challenges in recruiting trials, in really understanding the market opportunity, can be really challenging in pediatrics. And so I do think one that comes to mind that I was involved in is homozygous hypercholesterolemia, familial hypercholesterolemia. And it's, that disease is already a 1 in a million disease. And then when you're looking at doing a pediatric study, you really have to spend time with caregivers, parents, to understand their concerns about enrolling a patient in a trial, a pediatric patient in that type of a trial, particularly when your drug may have very significant side effects. So there has to be a lot of work done in advance before you sign up for something that may be really difficult to execute on.
No, that's really critical and important information to think about as you consider how to really enroll patients in these trials that can be so hard and challenging to find. Actually, that gets us to our next slide, Jen. If you could share some of the experiences around supporting clinical trial recruitment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in the different markets that I've been involved in, clinical trial recruitment is always one of the biggest challenges. I think, particularly in small biotech companies where you're working on a rare disease that it may be your star molecule in your portfolio or the first indication that you've entered into, you really want to understand the timeline to enroll in the trial and have a grasp of where the patients are. And truly the only way to do this is to spend a lot of time with the centers that would be treating the patients, cross-referencing the data that they're sharing with you through databases, retrospective databases, database analysis. I've also done some AI and machine learning on those databases just to really understand, are these patients being diagnosed appropriately and are they diagnosed timely? So is it possible that, again, back to the prevalence, that we may have misunderstood the prevalence, or are these patients really out there? And just really understanding where they are is most important, so that you know that the investigators who are in your trial are going to be able to recruit. I would say it's not, probably the dynamics of that aren't that different than a large prevalence disease, but I think some companies fall down when they make too many assumptions around the investigators being able to find these patients and enroll them quickly. That's the hard part.
Yeah, Jen, you and I have talked recently about how to stay engaged with the PIs and their trial staff to ensure they not only kind of got it up front, but that they're thinking about that patient type and it's still aligned with who's coming through the door or who they've identified, but maybe need to reach out to again.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'll give you an example. One of the rare diseases that I was involved in is treated by endocrinologists. And as we all know, endocrinologists are facing a diabetes epidemic. And so they may very well have a lot of energy around doing a rare disease trial because they've treated a rare disease. In this case, the rare disease that I'm referring to was generalized lipodystrophy. And again, it's an ultra rare disease. It's 1 in a million. And the physicians that we would speak to, of course, have very few patients, but they are considered to be experts in the area. And so it's really important to keep the trial itself top of mind, even after you have signed up a center and you have an investigator for whom they are passionate about the disease. It's not enough to just sort of sign them up and then expect that, within the next 6 months, they will enroll a patient that they already have in the trial or that they may think is going to be referred to them. It takes a lot of ongoing education and awareness with the office staff to ensure that they are following up, reaching out to the family, fully educating about the trial. There's a lot of awareness, one-on-one awareness that needs to go on with that investigator. And I'm sure, Beth, you've seen where companies will open a site, bring on an investigator, and that investigator doesn't actually enroll any patients. And sadly, I think that happens more often than it should in rare disease trials. And that typically is a signal that, it's perhaps that investigator shouldn't have signed up for that trial.
Yeah, so as you've been involved in clinical trial recruitment support, we've seen that across a lot of our teams where having someone in the early commercial new product planning role focused on how to support that trial site in addition to the clinical team is really important.
Absolutely.
Move on here. We can also talk a bit about that patient journey in rare disease. And Jen, this is something you and I talk about quite often, about thinking about the patient themselves and the caregiver journey and where they have challenges and how the commercial team or the clinical team can support that.
Yeah, there's, in rare disease, there really is nothing more important than truly understanding the diagnosis journey and the treatment journey. It's most important because you have to really truly understand how the patient is getting information, if they're misdiagnosed, if they've been on treatments that they may have been inappropriate at some point, the amount of confusion that they've had in their diagnosis, because that all leads ultimately to the level of trust that they will have going forward in participating in a clinical trial and trying new therapies. So I think, this spending time and investing in these understanding the patient journey is the most essential from the marketing and the clinical side. And some of the work that we've done in my past, we've done ethnography studies. So we will actually send a camera, or in the case of COVID, we'll ask the patients to video themselves and just talk about certain topics. And it is incredibly enlightening to understand how a disease really impacts a patient's day-to-day life. That can give you insights that even the physician and nurses may not be able to articulate. So that's just an example where, along this continuum of their experience, you're able to get some real insights that perhaps you can use to differentiate your product or even just the communication that you share with the patients, and ultimately building trust between a brand and the patient community. I think also in this patient journey, it's most important to be very closely aligned to the advocacy organizations and ensure that you have a broad understanding of the different types of patients that are out there. As we know in rare disease, one patient does not at all represent the typical experience, again, because there are typically just so few of them. So that, I would say, is another critical aspect of understanding the patient journey.
Yeah, that's incredibly critical. It's important to think about it from the clinical trial design perspective, from supporting them in terms of what education and resources are needed, and throughout, as you think about commercializing the product, what support program needs there are. I think we actually have a polling question coming up next.
Thank you very much, Beth. Yes, you do have a poll question. I will launch it right now. It's our first poll question, and it's done in real time, and it's appearing on your screen, and there it is. And so it's done in real time, as I was saying. So your participation is encouraged and very much appreciated. And the question we have for you today is, where do you think your product's biggest launch risks lie? I'll give you about 40 seconds to complete this simple poll question. So please select one of the below, and your options are market development, market access, changing the clinical paradigm, infrastructure, resources for execution. So please go ahead and cast your vote. It looks like we have the majority of our members of the audience have done so. So thank you very much. And for those of you who have not, please go ahead and do so now. I'll give you another 10 seconds, and then I will close the polls and share the results. Okay, thank you everyone for that. Now I'm going to close the polls and share the results. Okay, so our first poll question was, where do you think your product's biggest launch risks lie? And here are the results. 17% at market development, 33% at market access, 33% again changing the clinical paradigm, and 17% at infrastructure resources for execution. Thank you everyone for that poll, for participating in that poll question. Now I return it back to Beth and Jennifer.
Thanks, Tanya. It's interesting because we see, a broad spectrum of critical issues in that question. And some of those are still relevant as we're thinking about this patient support in particular, and how do we ensure reimbursement support when access is challenging? How does the patient support program support the needs of patients in terms of training, administration of a product? How do we engender digital innovation within our design? And what's the right level of copay support or reimbursement support? Not just technically how do we execute it, but what's the right level that's needed, and is that available given the forecast of the brand? Jen, we were talking before starting the webinar about how to go about the right design and some of the innovation going on in patient support. And in our next slide, I'm going to share some of the analog research that we do as a company. Can you talk for a minute about the kinds of patient support programs that you've been involved in developing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really encouraged to see that the audience responded to the poll, and many of them are focused on market access. Patient support programs in rare disease really take on a whole different level of importance than my experience in more prevalent diseases. And I think, the biggest distinction is that the manufacturer truly does become a resource to the family in ways that just don't typically come up in more prevalent diseases. And giving an example of this, just being able to get the drug to some of these families, typically patient support services will help with the shipping if it is a self-injected drug or an oral drug. Sometimes, depending on side effects, et cetera, there may be a REMS, so it's important for the shipping organization, the hub, to ensure that the patient gets the drug, et cetera. And some of the issues that can come up with these families is they don't have the mobility, they don't have the means to be able to pay the copay. They may be on Medicaid in some cases, particularly when it's a pediatric disease. And you need just more services, more interaction with the family on a regular basis to ensure that the patients can access their drug and that they're committed to staying adherent to the drug. That plays right into the advocacy of the payer. And I use the word advocacy with an important meaning behind it, and that is that, payers in some cases, if it's not a competitive market, will be very open to allowing rare disease patients access to the drug with very little barriers. But in the case where you don't build enough support services to ensure that those patients remain adherent, the payer will see that the patients are not utilizing or taking their drug frequently enough. And it can also, of course, affect efficacy. And so if the payer feels that they're not getting adequate efficacy, the physician is not advocating for that efficacy, and the patient isn't taking it frequently enough, you can lose that advocacy of the payer to allow access without barriers, and they will put in prior authorizations and other restrictions that you might otherwise not see when you're commercial. I would also say that this, understanding the patient and their experience through the patient journey that we just talked about in the clinical trial setting, that all applies really directly to preparing for commercialization and how you can support the patient and the caregivers around the patient. So all of that work is just essential to realize the important services that you need to bring to the table.
Absolutely. Some of what we've done to help our client teams think about this is some significant analog research and really determining what's the best practice for excellence. We look at those situations where there's alliances and how have they approached the alliance from the perspective of which product or company is presented or both. We have done a lot of work looking at the types of innovation and support service offerings and communication across industry analogs from large prevalence diseases to rare diseases, and even looking ex-US pharma for analogs to think about access, affordability, and concierge services and how they are approached outside of pharma and what kinds of new technology is enabled. We're doing a lot with pharma clients now who are considering the different kinds of technology solutions and startups that they might partner with to offer some really innovative approaches to help patients, to help with education, to help with getting product to patient, and to help with services. It's really an area of pharma commercialization that's on the cutting edge and growing. But we do that in rare disease, largely in partnership with thinking about the advocacy organizations and how to partner with them and how to help them support the patients in more ways and better ways. And I know, Jen, you've done a lot with working with rare disease and even sometimes helping new advocacy organizations are working in spaces where there aren't any advocacy organizations.
Yeah, I can't stress enough how important the advocacy work is in rare disease from the very beginning. I think, when you're in phase 2, you should have very close relationships with these advocacy organizations already. And understanding if there is an advocacy framework out there for your disease is essential, even, before, at the time when you're considering going into the clinic. The reason I say that is, back to what we were talking about earlier, which is just even being able to try, even finding these patients can be a challenge. And the place where we always start is with the advocacy organizations. Also, understanding the patient journey, just going back to the same themes we've been talking about. Where do I go when I want to understand the patient journey? I work with these advocacy organizations to meet patients, essentially, and begin to talk to them, have advisory boards, create patient steering committees. All of that framework is so essential, and the partner that you'll be working with to do all that is the advocacy organization. So in a situation where an advocacy organization doesn't exist, which I've also experienced, it's important to find engaged either families, parents, patients who already have built a community around them. And of course, with social media and the way we all use it now, often you can find this. What's most important is to find patients or caregivers who want to work with industry and have an openness to that, and who understand what the future may look like if they work with industry. I think also educating them, taking the time to educate these engaged families and parents and patients about how the regulators will also need their insights, very separate of industry, and that as this disease becomes more treated or treatable with more therapies coming forward, that it won't just be really industry that they're working with, but it will be across the board, regulators in Europe, regulators in the US. It will be potentially other types of vendors as well that are looking for their insights and voice. And that's really meaningful to these patients. Helping to establish an organization with them and giving them grant money as they request it to help establish those organizations is essential to your success.
I think one of the other areas we've seen these advocacy organizations help is to identify HCPs. Also, often in rare disease, you may know some of the academic physicians, but it's much harder to find the broad array of community-based physicians who may have these patients in their practices or may in the near future. And at that local level, when you are involved in the patients and their families, it can be a way to identify the HCPs in their communities who are involved, or sometimes those HCPs who are involved with the advocacy organizations already.
That is such a good point. Absolutely. I think, sometimes we assume, especially in the ultra rare diseases, that most of these patients are treated in an academic medical center. And I have yet to prove that point, actually. I think more often than not, particularly when there aren't a lot of therapies in a particular rare disease, that these patients are being treated more in the community and even sometimes in a primary care setting, because there just isn't a lot of treatments other than steroids or immunosuppressants.
Yeah, I think it can also address the length of time for diagnosis, as we can work through these communities to help educate patients and providers of what the misdiagnosis looks like and what these patients are often diagnosed incorrectly with, that can help to speed the diagnosis process for this type of patient.
Agree, absolutely.
The other thing we talk about is how do you find and engage with the thought leaders who can help you not only in that clinical design and understanding the insights, but help with the education of those community doctors or even primary care doctors and patient families who aren't yet quite as involved. So an advocacy effort is one step in that direction, but also more ways to find the right KOLs, and then the breadth of scientific communication that needs to be planned for. So we help a lot of our client teams think about the medical strategy pre and post launch, developing a robust scientific platform that tells the story and creates the lexicon for the disease, for disease education and brand communication. What are the evidence generation gaps, doing the pub assessment to identify what are the gaps and what kind of real world evidence or investigator initiated trials the organization might want to sponsor to supplement the primary trials. And then engaging with thought leaders who can help you form the scientific communication, but also be the voice potentially in speaker engagements and KOL videos and other things to get the education out to the marketplace. Jen, can you talk for a second about that aspect of it and the scientific platform development?
Oh, yeah, sure. I can talk about scientific platform development. I also just want to jump on what you just said, that one of the techniques that I think has fallen out of favor in some of the larger prevalence diseases is using advisory boards as a market research tool with both, key experts as well as community-based treaters. And I just want to say that in my experience in rare disease, there really is no better tool to than bringing different physicians together from different regions and different academic backgrounds to talk about their experience with rare disease, to really understand how incredibly differently it can be treated. So that's one thing. It seems so simple. I mean, there's no magic to doing an advisory board per se, but it is essential to do many of those to really understand how the differences across treatment patterns and treatment paradigms. In terms of scientific platform, I really can't say enough about having a uniform way, developing a uniform way to talk about both the disease and eventually the drug that you're developing, the mechanism. But I'm going to stress more importantly the disease itself, because as Beth said, in a lot of these diseases, there really isn't a lot of information out there about it, both for the patients and the physicians. So developing, language that the company will use, eventually the regulators will adopt, and the key experts will also turn to, is having that very uniform and consistent is important for the patients, to begin understanding their disease and interpreting what kind of different treatments might be out there for them, and when they're appropriate, when those treatments are appropriate. So, the scientific platform typically will do this with a medical communications agency. But I would say it evolves over time. It's not a one and done, and it is something that you need to put a lot of time and thought into as your brand evolves.
That's a really good point. Actually, Jen, you mentioned about advisory boards, and I just want to share our experience because we've done a few multi-customer advisory boards for rare disease and at the regional level. And this has been really helpful to get a perspective in a room of the HCPs, of regional payers, and advocacy representatives all at the table at the same time to talk about the prevalence, the disease and diagnosis pathway, the challenges that the patients have, and how this potential new product would impact care, and to get the understanding of what it's like in that particular region from all perspectives has really been eye-opening.
I think that's incredible. I think also just doing multidisciplinary advisory boards, because a lot of these patients are treated by a team of physicians with very different disciplines, can also be essential to understanding the treatment paradigm. I haven't done an ad board in the way you describe, Beth, but I'm imagining that can be incredibly informative.
Yeah, it was very engaging, and to recognize the different perspectives and how they were potentially influenced in that discussion helped us to think about the communication broadly into the marketplace after that.
That's great.
Brings us to a really critical aspect of commercializing a product for rare disease, which is establishing the value and the cost per quality framework and beyond that. And we think about what do payers look at in terms of their evaluation of a disease state and a need, which is the natural history of the disease. What's the epidemiology? Is it well understood? What's the cost and current treatment of care? What's the potential cost of a new treatment? And more, they're hearing the voice of patients directly and caregivers. When we think about the opportunities for engagement and commercial readiness, it's engage early and ongoing. Ensure you have an aligned understanding of the disease, the prevalence of the disease, the epidemiology, and that can be very regionally. Get feedback on the target product profile and how they see it meeting customer needs, meeting patient needs and HCP needs, and the cost of it. Working with payers to think about the data generation that would be relevant for them as you move into commercialization and potentially phase 4 trials as well. Helping to bring that advocacy voice to the discussion with payers as they're thinking about the coverage decisions. And of course, talking through framework for price and agreements. We have some examples from the marketplace that has really been changing over the last few years. We look at Pfizer EMD Serono, which launched Bavencio for Merkel cell carcinoma. And it was among the first that had a single arm open label trial with a real world evidence as the comparator. And that's a really different dynamic than traditional trials and can open up a world of opportunity in trial design. So an interesting thing to think about. We also look at Alnylam, which was a new commercial entity that established a patient access philosophy. They published a price stability commitment. They were very quick to engage with payers to get value-based contracts with many payers. And in fact, they talk, and you can even look this up on their website, about their perspective on prevalence-based adjustments to trigger rebates and how they will look at their patient population, their product opportunity, and engagement with payers at the beginning and over time. So there's definitely examples in the marketplace of real innovation in thinking about access issues for rare disease. When we look at...
I was just going to add that Alnylam is one of those companies that I think has done that so incredibly well, and we've all been kind of learning from the Mercks of the world that started this sort of performance-based contracting in diabetes and some other large prevalence diseases. And I think few of us would have thought that this performance-based contracting would come to rare disease.
Right.
But it certainly has arrived, even in situations where the market is not competitive. So it's something to kind of do your homework on and be ready to put forth a strategy.
That's a perfect segue into my next slide. We actually put up a visual that represents the variety of ways that you can engage with payers, which is the traditional insight generation and discussions around cost and value. But more and more, it's around evidence generation. It's looking at potentially outcome-based contracts. It's looking at that support for adherence that Jen mentioned earlier. And we've done a lot more in recent years at the value-based contracting strategy and helping organizations think about what could they be, who are the payers that you could engage with, what would be the payer's perspective on the opportunity of value-based contracting, and how do you really establish something that's a potential win for both sides. So there's a lot more of that kind of commercial strategy and payer strategy going on in rare disease that we've been involved with. Hopefully that leads to success and access for both sides that offers more opportunity for patients to get access to products. We're going to switch for about the last 5 or 10 minutes of the talk into what it looks like as you're working through establishing a commercial organization. And we talk a lot about the building a launch plan and the identifying risk register items and planning risk mitigation. But I want to start with the commercial team, because it's really important to think about the team that you're building, whether that's your team that you're hiring in or teams that you might be engaging with on a contract basis, both field teams and commercial support teams like we do as Hearst People Consulting. We do a tremendous amount of staff augmentation and becoming commercial teams for small organizations. It's really about having both the hard skills and the soft skills, about ensuring your team has planning, resource management, experience in the key areas of patient services and distribution, but also the soft skills. It can be a challenging place to launch a new product in rare disease. You have to have a realistic perspective, engaging with customers on the topic. You have to have agility to work through the challenges of executing in a rare disease environment, really be innovative, and especially that advocacy engagement skill. Jen, you talked a little bit before we started today with me about the contract organization perspective of the future in rare disease.
Yeah, I think, more and more what I'm seeing is that some of the biotech companies that are, again, they may have a lead product in a rare disease indication, are, instead of taking the risk of building an internal organization, are leaning on contract organizations, not only for sales, but also for marketing. And, Beth, you guys have helped me in that way, where we've been doing marketing together while we were waiting for some data to come through. And I think that's a really important and thoughtful way, if you're a P&L owner, to build out your team. Additionally, I just want to say, back to the soft skills, that rare disease, unlike my experience on prevalence diseases, really requires a level of creativity. So when you're hiring people, don't underestimate your leadership team. And I mean, I'll just give an example, hiring somebody to build out your hub, your patient services organization. One would think, okay, well, this is really about access, and it's about, distribution, ensuring the patients can get the product. Really, ultimately, in rare disease, I think of that hub person. Yes, they have to have all those hard skills like Beth was describing, and they have to understand those, key elements of getting the product to the patient, but they have to be patient-oriented people. And that is the difference. I think people in our industry are very patient-oriented, but in rare disease, you have to be comfortable with a certain level of interacting with patients and families that sometimes may make you feel uncomfortable. And that takes a special person with a certain type of openness. So I'll just leave that as food for thought for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk a bit more now about the secret to successful planning. We look at, this is really similar across rare disease and larger prevalence disease, the approach to commercialization, ensuring you have objective insight and a compelling strategy using all of your various tools from market research to advocacy and KOL engagement, ensuring there's a comprehensive and integrated plan as early as possible, and that helps you with tracking and also helps you with risk identification mitigation as you look at that plan. We'll talk briefly about tracking and measurement and effective decision making. The objective insight and compelling strategy, as we think about, there's certainly traditional market research, but it can be much more challenging in rare disease markets. So it's critically important to be able to stand up HCP advisory groups, whether that's one-offs or oftentimes standing advisory groups. Having relationships with thought leaders that will help you be able to just pick up the phone and ask a quick question or engage them more broadly. Advocates that can help you think about the patient needs, the caregiver needs, the regional differences, a way to get to patients themselves, and those are often through the HCPs, and there are also such organizations like Rare Patient Voice that can help you find them, as well as the advocacy groups. And then sometimes if you're a new commercial entity, having a cadre of commercial experts, whether that's someone like Hurst-Bickel Consulting, who are engaged for that purpose, or even just a network of people who do this in their own commercial roles. It's important to have good advisory services of a variety of ways. We'll talk about the way to think about a plan. As with any commercial readiness, you want to think about a plan that addresses all of the cross-functional aspects that you need, from regulatory to supply chain to marketing and creating the robust brand positioning and messaging, creating the scientific education and the value proposition for access, and really a very detailed go-to-market plan. And doing these things at the right point in time and working through cross-functional, which can be sometimes challenging in small organizations where there's potentially an N of 1 or N of 0 in some of these roles. So this is where having a partner like Hurst-Bickel Consulting or others who can be a thought partner and help to develop the approach can be really valuable. Jen, you've worked with us a bit on this. I'm sure you've done this with others, and you started a new commercial organization in your latest role at Momenta. Do you want to talk for a second about what that looks like?
Yeah, I think, ultimately even in an early stage, you need to be thinking about what the commercial model looks like for your different indications, and it may not look the same across different indications that you're entering into. And having a robust team of thought partners there when you're in a commercial leadership position is really essential. And I think we were talking earlier, having customer-based stakeholders that you can turn to kick ideas around with, as well as internal folks on your team, is really critical. All of these steps you go through at different times as well. It doesn't all sort of happen at once. It's over a slow period of time, and you have to iterate on them. So it's not like you're just checking a box and that's done and you move on.
Yeah.
You keep coming back to it.
Over and over, and really thinking about the new approaches as you gain new information, definitely.
Absolutely.
When I move on, we only have a few more minutes. There's really a value in having commercial leaders such as Jen and others who have gone through a commercial launch, whether that's rare disease or elsewhere, and can think about the risks and identify them early. And that's part of what we do as a commercial partner as well at Hurst-Bickel Consulting, is to work across all of the functional areas and highlight what could potentially be risks and what could be opportunities for the brand, and really ensuring that the organization is thinking about them as early as possible, planning mitigations. How can you address, no one could have addressed COVID coming along and making all of the world virtual in it. We wouldn't have thought of that in advance, but as it was happening, how quickly we helped organizations pivot for that, still to be able to do market development in this new COVID world. How do you bring market access perspective to the plan and think about the risks for access issues and payer decision making and timing in a launch. So we would suggest, as you think about your commercialization, that you really think across each of the cross-functional teams to identify risks and put mitigation plans in place. I'm going to kind of get through a few of our next slides pretty quickly so we can go to some Q&A. One of the aspects that every organization looks at is what should our key performance indicators be and what should we track. We like to think about it like a Goldilocks perspective. You have to have the kind of the right amount, not too much, not too little. At first, you want to think about the internal activities and readiness. So you can think, is your organization moving along very quickly and at the right pace? And then it really becomes about customer engagement and what are your leading and lagging indicators. Can you address and identify access indicators quickly to see if you're having challenges to not achieving the strategy you had in place? We actually have a platform that's AI enabled that can help organizations to track the field performance and the access marketplace to be able to really work very quickly and dynamically to be an agile organization. This is an area where again, you want to make sure that you have things you are evaluating as a commercial team to identify, are you on track? Are there areas that are becoming risk that you need to address? Very critical, important factor for commercial readiness. Launch planning, if you haven't yet and you're heading into a commercial launch, you should have a robust plan built and a governance organization help make decisions and that KPI tracking in place. Really achieving forecast for a brand, it's more than just the right go-to-market model. It's about having a clear strategy that's aligned to customer needs. It's about having a robust plan in place and resourcing it appropriately to get all of those things done, or identifying where you're making decisions to delay things. Risk management and an aligned organization that can help make decisions quickly and be agile. As we talked about, things, you get new insights all the time. You're revisiting decisions quite often, and you need to be prepared to do that. We're running up on time, so we missed some of our poll questions because we had so much to say. I want to just end here and give us a chance to answer some of the questions that may have come in. Sonia, if you have a Q&A that you want to open to.
Yes, I will. I'll start that right away. Just to say thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And just like Beth has said, we're now going to do the Q&A portion of the webinar. So please continue to send in your question using that questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to it. So here's our first question. And the question is, how do you best leverage advocacy organizations in rare disease? And what do you do if there are no established advocacy organizations for your disease state?
Great, thank you, Sonia. You know, Jen, we did talk about this briefly, and when you are in a place where you don't have advocacy organizations in a rare disease, you said you generally will try and get patients who are very engaged already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like we did talk about this one. Yeah, it is important to find those engaged patients and to help them organized. I think that's the key answer here.
Yeah, we'll go quickly. Sonia, do you have one more question?
Yes, I have a couple of questions, but let's try to squeeze in these two that just came in from the audience members. The question is, what approach do you recommend in defining the patient journey and the optimal service offerings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's about getting the right insights from the patients themselves, doing the ethnography and other kinds of market research, holding advisory boards with patient groups and patient advocacy groups. And a critical aspect is to look and evaluate those benchmarks and the analogs that are out there in the marketplace.
Okay. All right. Let me squeeze in one last question here. How will the landscape of rare disease product launch change in the next 5 years?
Jen, I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah. I think a couple things we've covered. I think things are becoming more competitive, and so it won't just be one new product launching into a rare disease typically, especially the ones that are more prevalent. The payer market, the market access side of things is also becoming more demanding, and proving a value story even in rare disease is essential. So we can't just assume that because it's a new product in a very rare disease that the payers will approve it and allow access to it openly. Digital is huge, using digital medium to communicate your messaging, getting, engaging patients, et cetera. And also, I guess finally, one of the things I said as well is just use of contractors to do sales and marketing and promotion. That's a whole new thing that's coming to rare disease as well. So, a lot of new dynamics that are affecting the rare disease markets as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
really important to have commercial leaders with some great experience and insight and commercial strategy like yourself, Jen. It's a pleasure to work with you. Sonia, I think we're right up at the hour, so we're probably running out of time for Q&A.
Yeah, we have. Okay. Well, thank you very much for those questions. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Herspiegel Consulting may follow up with you after this presentation. Now, if you have further questions, direct them to the email address that's on your screen, and that's the email address for Beth right there. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in your chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event at that link and also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording as well. So I encourage you to do that. And get even more out of today's presentation by downloading the supporting materials available under the Handouts tab. And we have one there for you, Evolving Access Considerations for Commercializing in Rare Disease. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Beth Sherman, Partner, Herspiegel Consulting, and Jennifer Beachall, Vice President Commercial at Momenta Pharmaceuticals, for that very insightful and detailed presentation. So thank you very much, ladies. We
Thank you
have
for the time.
no problem.
Thank you.
We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at XTalks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now.